Chapter 15, Video 1, we're starting to gear toward the Civil War at this point, so we need to lay some groundwork so we know what the South in particular was like as we lead toward the Civil War. There were some folks, we were primarily agriculture based, as we've mentioned. There were some folks by 1840 who were saying that the South needed to diversify, but the wealthy Southerners weren't interested in doing so. For one reason, they didn't know who would come and work in their factories because they didn't believe that black people had the skill or intellectual ability to come and work in a factory. Secondly, they had sort of a disdain for industrial activity. There was honor and prestige in being a plantation owner, and there wasn't so much of that to be a factory owner. They also, in purely economic terms, were making a far greater return on their investment in slavery than what they would get from a factory. They were making more money than what they could make if they ran a factory, so they weren't interested in shifting over to a more industrial-based economy. Now, there were different levels in society at the time, and of course, the top level of Southern society were the plantation owners. Generally speaking, when your farm got big enough to have 20 or more slaves, your farm was no longer called a farm, it's called a plantation, and you are a planter. This class of people made up less than 4% of the population. It was a very small number of Southerners who had a plantation. They are going to dominate the cotton and tobacco market, though, and as well as the sugar and rice markets. And as we turn more and more to cotton, this is where they will make big money. Only about 25% of Southerners owned a slave, and the majority of Southerners who owned a slave owned just one slave. So it's a little different picture than what we see in a lot of Hollywood movies and so forth. 70% of Southerners didn't have a slave at all. So if you were alive back then, chances are you did not have a slave. But those folks still supported the slave system. Now, we do make a comment about the wife of the plantation owner having an enormous amount of work to do. She didn't just sit around and do nothing. She had a lot of responsibilities there on the plantation as well. And then when you come down from the plantation owners, you have the middle class. And this is a wide variety of people in the middle class. You have the overseers of the plantation. You have skilled workers, the artisans like the silversmiths and the blacksmiths and so forth. Smaller farm families who might have a couple slaves or one slave, but they certainly don't fit in that plantation class. This is where you find the most mobile people, because some of these folks were not tied to land. They didn't own land, and so they're going to move around a bit more. They tended to be evangelical Protestant. They tended to vote Democrat. They tended to not trust the government. They're going to support slavery because they don't want competition for land or jobs or what have you. And in 1849, in fact, there was a referendum on slavery in Kentucky, and they will vote to continue to have slavery in Kentucky, even though, like I said, 70% of them statistically did not have a slave. When you come down from the middle class, then you have the poor whites, who are usually going to have the least desirable land, and they'll have to augment what they grow with things that they hunted for or caught while they were fishing. These are folks who are going to suffer from a lot of what kind of got classified as lazy diseases, things like hookworm, malaria, pellagra, and so forth, some of these that you could get from going barefoot, and they pull nutrients out of your system and cause lethargy in the person suffering from them. It's also in this time period that you have to note that Southerners had a very prickly sense of honor. We were easily offended. It was pretty overly dramatic at times, but we were very easily offended. And so when Northerners start telling us what to do and that we were horrible, awful people for having slavery, we're really going to get our back up. When you look at black society in the South, you have different classes there as well. And at the top level for black society, you have the free blacks. Now, the number of slaves was growing and growing. The number of free blacks wasn't growing at the same rate. The 1830 census indicated that there were roughly 319,000 free blacks in the United States. A little less than half of them were in the South, in the northern parts of the South. Some of these free blacks had bought their freedom in the early days. Some had been rewarded with their freedom for military service. Some had been freed when their master died and felt guilty about having slavery, and so forth. Now, the 1830 census also does indicate that there were some free blacks who owned slaves. And that's a very awkward situation, certainly, but it seems that the majority of them were people who had been able to buy their family members, free blacks who were able to buy their family members out of slavery. Those folks would still count as a slave, even if they were bought in those circumstances. And these free blacks are going to have trades and be artisans, be farmers, common laborers, a variety of different things. Not high-level professions, but different professions at least. It's a very awkward position for them in society. They can't travel without permission. They can't vote. They could be easily kidnapped back into slavery. They couldn't testify in court against a white person. You couldn't have a church service where the congregation was predominantly black and the minister was black. There were a lot of rules and restrictions placed on the free blacks in the North. It was a disappointment for some slaves when they would escape to the North. Yes, things were better in the North, but they didn't have the complete freedom that they thought they would have and the rights and so forth that they thought they would have once they got to the North.